What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back to the Broncos Podcast Network and YouTube for the latest episode of Broncos Now. Team reporter and host Sydney Jones here. And coming up on today's episode, we'll discuss the announcement of the Broncos' new alternate helmet. And we'll talk about the upcoming NFL draft. All that and more coming up. Joining me here inside the Broncos podcast studio is Broncos lead writer Aric DiLalla. Aric, thanks for joining the show again today. It's been a while.
It has been a while.
It's been a couple weeks since we've had you on.
Nice to be back.
It's nice to have you back. It's kind of been a bit of a slow week here, but the Broncos, they did announce on social media that they're introducing an alternate helmet, so that's exciting.
That is exciting, yeah. Fans are, I think, a little bit of buzz about what that means.
Right.
Not a ton of details yet. Obviously, the NFL changed the rule a couple of years ago that you can wear an alternate helmet now, and people might say, okay, well, you wear a different helmet, right, with the blue jersey. Sometimes you do the throwback D. Well, technically, it's the same helmet. They're just changing the sticker color or stickers that are on those. It's the same base color of the helmet. So what this allows the team to do is change the color of the helmet. No official announcement about when the Broncos are going to wear these. They can wear them for up to 2 games, and they will be paired with that Color Rush uniform. But a little bit of a TBD there. More to come for sure.
Yeah, Eric Leach, he hinted at it last week at the league's meetings, owners' meetings. So we'll see. Like you mentioned, we don't have any details yet, but it's exciting. I think Broncos fans should be excited. I'm excited to see what it looks like.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah. Well, Eric, it's kind of hard to believe I'm even saying this, but it's April, so the NFL draft is coming up at the end of the month. We're just a couple weeks away now. I know the Broncos, they have 5 picks, 2 third-rounders, a 4th, a 5th, and a 6th. What positions do you think the Broncos, might target?
Yeah, well, the Broncos, first of all, they hit a lot of needs in free agency. And we heard Sean Payton say last week, we hit all the musts on our list. We heard George Payton then talk about the importance of, I think he said, making some hay in this draft. Really hitting on these picks since you don't have all that many of them. I think when you look around, Sydney, the positions that you still see mentioned are interior offensive line, whether that's a center. Obviously, the Broncos signed Kyle Fuller to provide some depth there, but maybe it's somebody on the interior offensive line. You've seen edge rusher come up a lot just because obviously Bradley Chubb was traded last year. Randy Gregory did not play in every game. He struggled with some injuries last year. And then you've got some guys like Nick Bonito, Baron Browning, who will kind of look to take that next step. So that's a position. And then I've seen inside linebacker, cornerback also mentioned. So, it really wouldn't surprise me if they go any direction there, because even look at like a wide receiver or a running back.
Right.
If Sean Payton wants to get his type of guy in here from a skill position or add depth at running back with Javonte Williams coming back from an injury, those are all possibilities. And so I think that's what makes this exciting is when you have somebody new in place like Sean Payton, and he's making these decisions with George Payton, you don't know exactly what this is going to look like, right? And I think the other part of it is that when you're picking in the 3rd round, you're not at 15 overall where you can kind of go through these mock drafts and figure out, okay, who's available, how many times is Jerry Jeudy going to be on the board at 15, for example. I have a feeling they're probably not going through and doing a bunch of 66 pick mock drafts to get to 67. Maybe they're still doing some, but it's harder to guess, I think, of who's going to be there. So you got to have a lot of good options that you like.
Yeah. Eric, you mentioned mock drafts. Despite us not having a 1st or 2nd round pick, I know there's, a ton of mock drafts still circulating around. So what are some names that you've seen out there?
Yes, and we just put together a mock draft roundup on denverbroncos.com. So some of those names, Zach Harrison from Ohio State, an edge rusher that's probably worth keeping an eye on. My understanding, high potential, maybe a guy that the Broncos would be lucky if he slips down there. Joe Tippmann, a center from Wisconsin. Again, some different interior players mentioned there for the Broncos. Keanu Benton, a defensive tackle from Wisconsin. Clark Phillips, a corner from Utah. So a lot of different names here. I think you've started to see some names come out in this pre-draft process of who the Broncos are hosting on these top 30 visits, which it's kind of funny calling it a top 30 visit, right, when it's for pick 67, but it's the Broncos'
not a top 30 player.
It's the Broncos' top 30 player. And so you've seen some reports there, and I would imagine those will kind of, we've seen reports of a quarterback. We've seen reports of some defensive players. So I just think in the third round, it may not be a household name or a name that people recognize immediately, but that doesn't mean that can't be an impact player. I mean,
Yeah,
you
definitely.
look at Quinn Miners. I think, probably not a lot of people had heard of Quinn Miners coming out of a small school. If you knew of Quinn Miners, it was probably because of his stomach and, pushing over trees. And so, still a really good chance to get a high quality player there, even if you kind of have to learn a little bit more about them once the pick is made.
Yeah, Baron Browning, he was also a third round pick. Lloyd Cushenberry, I mean, guys who are starters now. So definitely can have impact.
Yeah, and they have to for this team, right? Because the Broncos have filled a lot of needs in free agency, but the lifeblood of a team has to be building through the draft. And when you don't have first and second round picks, you've got to hit probably a little bit more than you would normally in those later rounds. And you've got to find a Damari Mathis. You've got to find these guys that can come in and contribute. And listen, they don't have to be star players, right? They don't have to be that, especially in year one. But you want to find guys that can make some sort of contribution. You think of how many injuries the Broncos had last year, knock on wood, that won't happen again. But these guys are going to contribute. Pretty much everyone who made the team last year, Sydney, contributed in some fashion, and a lot of guys that weren't on the roster at the beginning of the year. So
that's true.
A lot on the line here when the draft arrives in a few weeks.
And you think about special team guys, too. I mean, Sean Payton, he put a big focus and emphasis on that at the league meeting last week, too. So a lot of guys they could draft in that realm as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked a lot about these third-round picks, the two that they've got there. I've seen some mock drafts that suggest maybe the Broncos take one player there and then trade down to get a couple more picks. Right. But listen, there's also that 4th, 5th, and 6th on day 3. Probably not going to get 3 starters out of that, but maybe you make a good pick. Maybe you hit on somebody. I believe in Sean Payton's first draft in New Orleans, or an early draft, a couple of 7th-round picks he made that ended up being really, really good football players for that team. So certainly not out of the realm of possibility that you could find long-term contributors.
Absolutely. Well, Aric, the offseason program is coming up. I know the NFL schedule has the Broncos set to start their voluntary offseason program on April 11th. I know last week at the owners' meetings, both George Paton and head coach Sean Payton talked about the importance of, phase 1 and focusing on strength and conditioning. It's hard to believe the players are already going to be back next week, but you kind of just talk about how, important that is. You mentioned the injuries earlier.
Yeah. I think that sometimes we overlook, ourselves, fans, we overlook the importance of certain steps of this program, this process, and we think ahead to, okay, what's it going to look like in training camp? And it's fun to speculate in how many wins are the Broncos going to have or who's going to start at this position. I think good football teams take advantage of each day. And when Sean Payton was hired here, that was one of the things he said was that we need to be a little bit better tomorrow than we were today. And we need to get better and take advantage of this time and, have the right, we heard from owner and CEO Greg Penner down in Arizona, and he said success is partially determining the right process, having the right culture, those sorts of things. And so you take that from kind of this like macro sense of, okay, hey, we're going to focus on everything. The details are going to matter. Okay, well, here's one of our first opportunities where you see that. It's the offseason program. Players can come in here and the way the NFL has it set up is you only have to spend a couple of weeks on phase 1 where it's lifting and conditioning, and then you can get to football. In Sean Payton's mind, the Broncos need more time than that. And he's seen through his time in New Orleans, the acclimation process that it takes for these high-level athletes to get up to speed, to get into football shape. And he said down at the league meeting, we're going to lift and we're going to run for a month because 2 or 3 weeks is not enough. And so I think that's the first sign of how important details are to him of establishing a culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
And listen, I think it's going to teach you something about this team of who's willing to buy into that. And I would imagine the guys all will be, but hey, who's going to do their very best at lifting weights and being a little bit better at that the next day? Who's going to take the conditioning seriously? And hey, we're not easing up 2 yards before the sprint is finished. We're running the whole way through the line. Those things are important. Definitely. And I think set the tone. The leaders on this football team will help kind of determine that. There's some hardworking guys on this team. So Sean Payton will help get the most out of them, and that starts next week.
I know everyone's excited for them to be back in the building. Last one here for you, Aric. For some of our casual fans, what do the next couple weeks look like? What does the offseason program really look like?
Yeah, good question. There's a bunch of different phases here, right?
Yeah.
Phase 1, like I mentioned, is running and conditioning. Kind of a little bit of, you can be on the field, just players. And then you get to phase 2, and you can do a little bit more, some walkthrough stuff, no offense versus defense,
Right.
But you're able to get out on the field. And then phase 3 is, people know that more kind of casually as OTAs, organized team activities. And at that point, you can do offense versus defense. There's still no contact. You're not in pads, none of that stuff. But it is an opportunity to kind of get that first taste of real football, if you will. Most teams, we'll see what the Broncos end up doing. Most teams host a mini camp for rookies after the draft in May. A lot of teams host a mandatory mini camp at the end of the offseason program in June. So that's kind of a chance to simulate training camp, not with the contact, but you have all these practices, and then you also have time to meet. Whereas the rest of the offseason program, Sydney, there's limitations on how long you can have guys in the building, how long you can be doing football activities. And so the mandatory mini camp, there's still limits, but it simulates training camp more closely. And then we're off, and it's only a few weeks until the real thing gets started.
Gosh, time's flying by.
It really is.
Off-season always does.
Yes.
Well, Aric, appreciate you joining the show today, and thanks for your insight.
You got it.
Well, that'll do it for today's episode of Broncos Now, Broncos Country. Thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure to stay up to date on the latest episodes by following the Denver Broncos YouTube channel and staying up to date on denverbroncos.com. I will see you all next time.